The road south had taken 3 weeks, and in all that time, Robb Stark had not once seen his father look uncertain until the Towers of Kings. Landing rose up out of the haze along the Blackwater, and something in Lord Eddard Stark's shoulders changed. It was a small thing, a tightening, the kind of shift a son notices in a father he has watched his whole life, even if he cannot yet name what it means. Robb noticed it. He said nothing. He was 15 name days old, tall for his age in the way northern boys often were, with his mother's auburn coloring and his father's solemn quiet. Though the quiet did not come as naturally to him as it did to Ned. He had grown up practicing with Theon and Jon in the yard at Winterfell, listening to Maester Luwin's lessons on the history of the Seven Kingdoms with half an ear, dreaming more of the day he would ride out to inspect the northern holdfasts as his father's, ere than of court intrigue in a southern capital he'd never seen. He had assumed, when word came that King Robert intended to name Ned Stark his hand, that he would stay behind, that Winterfell needed a Stark in it, and that Stark would be him, with Maester Luwin and his mother to guide him until his father's business in the south concluded. His father had thought otherwise. "You are Robb Stark," Ned had told him, the night before they rode south, in the solar where the fire always burned low and orange. "One day you will hold this castle and everything north of the neck. You will treat with lords who smile at you while reaching for a knife, and you will need to know how that is done before the day comes that you must do it alone. I would rather you learn it now, at my side, than later, at your own cost." Robb had wanted to argue. He hadn't. It was not a boy's place to argue with Eddard Stark, not truly, and some small part of him, the part that still measured himself against Jon's steadiness, against the weight of being heir rather than merely son, had been quietly, guiltily pleased to be chosen. Bran would stay. Rickon was too young to understand. Sansa and Arya were coming as well, for reasons of their own. But it was Robb his father wanted beside him when he sat the small council table. And there was a kind of pride in that, however uneasy. Winterfell, in that moment, had felt very far away. It felt farther still now, with the Red Keep's towers catching the late sun like teeth. They rode through the city gates in the late afternoon, and King's Landing hit Robb like a physical thing, the smell first. A sour tangle of fish guts and sewage and wood smoke that no amount of Winterfell's cold stone had prepared him for. And then the noise, a constant churning roar of hawkers and beggars and cartwheels on cobblestone. That made the North silences feel like another world entirely. Men shouted prices for eels and roasted chestnuts. A septon harangued a small crowd about the Seven's judgment. Somewhere behind them, in the column, Sansa was audibly delighted. Delighted, and Arya was audibly not. And Robb found himself gripping his reins a little tighter, doing his best impression of a lord's son who was not, in fact, faintly overwhelmed. He caught his father watching him. Ned said nothing either, but there was something in his eyes, not disapproval. Never that, but a kind of watchful weighing, as if he were cataloging every flicker of discomfort on his son's face and deciding, silently, how much of the game Robb was ready to see. The Red Keep swallowed them whole. Robb had grown up in a castle of gray stone and old wood, of drafts and direwolves and a godswood, where the trees remembered 10,000 years. The Red Keep was heat and marble and gold leaf, a place that seemed built to remind every visitor of exactly how small they were. He met King Robert that first evening, a big, loud, red-faced man who embraced Ned like a brother and looked at Robb with an assessing eye that made him feel, for one uncomfortable moment, like a horse being priced at market. "Ned's boy," Robert said, clapping a heavy hand on Robb's shoulder hard enough to rock him. "Got your mother's coloring? Thank the gods. Not this one's miserable Stark face. You ride? Hunt? Good. We'll want to hunt before the tourney." And then the king's attention moved on, already bored, already reaching for his wine. And Robb understood, with a small cold clarity, that felt older than his 15 years, that he had just been measured and found adequately unremarkable, and that this, in King's Landing, was perhaps the safest thing to be. It did not last. 2 days later, at a small council session his father brought him to observe, watch, listen, say nothing, learn how men lie to each other's faces. Robb felt the first true weight of Southern eyes upon him. Lord Peter Baelish, master of coin, A slight man with a mocking half-smile that never quite reached his eyes, studied Robb across the table with the particular attention of a man reading a ledger for discrepancies. Lord Varys, soft-spoken and soft-handed, asked him gentle questions about Winterfell's grain stores that felt, somehow, like they were about something else entirely. And Cersei Lannister, the queen, said almost nothing to him at all, which unsettled Robb more than anything Baelish or Varys managed. Because her silence had a texture to it, a patience. Like a cat watching a mouse hole, it was in no hurry to strike. They will all want something from you, Ned told him afterward, as they walked the winding halls back toward the Tower of the Hand, their boots echoing on stone that never seemed to grow anything but colder, despite the southern heat. Some of them will want you as a friend to the Starks when the North matters to them. Some will want you as a weakness to exploit when it doesn't. You will not always know which is which until it is too late to matter. That is why I brought you. Better you learn to tell the difference watching me stumble than stumble yourself. Alone, when I am not here to catch you. When I am not here. Robb turned the words over that night, lying awake in a guest chamber too warm, too soft, too far from the cold certainty of his own bed at Winterfell. He thought of Bran, probably climbing something he shouldn't be. Of Jon, somewhere at the wall by now, taking the black in a world Robb had never fully understood, and now, feeling this southern strangeness pressing in on him, understood a little better what it was to be sent somewhere entirely unlike home and told to become a man there. He thought, too, of Winterfell itself, empty of Starks who mattered, save for small Rickon and a maester and a mother's household, while both the lord and his heir sat here, in this gilded, stinking, knife-smiling city, 3 weeks and a kingdom away from the seat of their power. It did not occur to him yet to wonder what that meant if something went wrong. He was 15, and his father was Eddard Stark, the most honorable man in the 7 kingdoms. And men like that did not fall. He would learn otherwise. Everyone in King's Landing eventually did. For now, he closed his eyes against the unfamiliar ceiling, listened to a city that never truly went quiet the way Winterfell's nights did, and told himself that this was simply his father's lesson beginning. Politics. Patience. The weighing of men's faces. He did not yet know that he was not merely a student in this place. He was a hostage the game had not yet realized it was holding. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The tourney for the Hand's honor came a fortnight after their arrival, and it was there that Robb first understood the true shape of the game. His father had brought him south to learn. He watched it from the stands beside Sansa, who was radiant with the spectacle of it, knights in bright armor, banners snapping in the wind off the Blackwater, the roar of 10,000. Small folk packed shoulder to shoulder to watch. Highborn men try to kill each other with blunted lances for sport and honor. Robb had expected, on some level, to enjoy it the way Sansa did. He was a lord's son. Tourneys were meant to stir something in the blood. Instead, he found himself watching the crowd more than the joust. Watching the way Peter Baelish moved through the private boxes exchanging quiet words with this lord and that. Watching the way Cersei Lannister's smile never once reached past her mouth. Watching his own father sit rigid and grim beside the king as if the whole affair were an obligation rather than a celebration. "You don't like it," said a voice at his shoulder, and Robb turned to find Tyrion Lannister settling into the seat beside him with a wineskin, already half drained, his mismatched eyes bright with something between amusement and genuine curiosity. Most northern lords don't, in my experience. All that Southron spectacle. You'd rather be putting an arrow through a boar in your own god's wood. I'd wager. I don't mind the tourney, my lord, Robb said carefully, because his father's lessons on careful speech were still fresh, enough to feel unnatural in his mouth. I mind not knowing what it's for. Tyrion's eyebrows rose, and for a moment the amusement in his face sharpened into something more attentive. Now that, he said, is the most interesting thing a Stark has said to me since I arrived in this city. Go on. Robb hesitated, and then, because there was something disarming about Tyrion's directness, something that felt closer to northern plainness than anything else he'd encountered south of the neck, he continued. Every man here is watching something other than the joust. My father watches the king drink too much and worries. Lord Baelish watches the crowds and counts something I can't see. The queen watches everyone and shows nothing. It's not a tourney. It's a stage, and I don't know my lines. No one gives you your lines here, boy, Tyrion said, not unkindly. You have to write your own, and hope they don't get you killed before the second act. That's the whole of it. That's King's Landing. He took a long pull from the wineskin, studying Robb with new interest. Your father brought you south to learn that. Wise of him, in a city that eats naive. Lords for breakfast and picks its teeth. With their bannermen. Foolish of him, too, perhaps. Every lesson has its price. And this city charges more than most. Robb did not fully understand what he meant, not then. He would, before the fortnight was out. The trouble began, as it so often did in King's Landing, with Joffrey. It was 3 days after the tourney. In a training yard, Robb had taken to using in the mornings to keep his sword arm sharp, against the softness of court life. When the crown prince arrived with Sandor, Clegane trailing him like a shadow and a look on his face that Robb had already learned, in his short time at court, to recognize as trouble dressed in golden trim. Joffrey was, in Robb's private assessment, everything his father had warned him a Southron prince might be, and worse. Petulant, cruel in small, unthinking ways, aware of his own power and utterly untested in the wielding of it. The wolf boy, Joffrey said, by way of greeting, looking Robb up and down with open contempt. I hear the North breeds men who smell of dog and dress like peasants. You certainly dress like one. Robb had been raised better than to rise to such bait. Ned Stark's lessons on patience were not so easily forgotten, but he was also 15, proud, and 3 weeks removed from a home where no one spoke to a Stark with such careless disdain. I dress for riding, my prince, not for court, he said, keeping his voice even. Where I'm from, men are measured by what they can do, not what they're wearing while they don't do it. Something flickered across Joffrey's face, surprise. First, that a northern boy would answer him at all, and then a flush of anger that promised nothing good. You forget yourself. I am the crown prince, and I am the heir to Winterfell and the north, Robb said, and heard, even as he said it, his father's voice underneath his own. Careful, careful. Too late to stop the words. I don't forget who either of us is. I simply don't see why it should frighten me. The silence that followed felt, to Robb, like the moment before a blade is drawn. Sandor Clegane's scarred face showed nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if it had shown amusement. Joffrey's hand had drifted, unconsciously, toward the ornamental sword at his hip, a boy's gesture, not a swordsman's, but a gesture that spoke to something ugly underneath the prince's golden manners. It was Tyrion, appearing as if from nowhere with impeccable timing and an expression of theatrical boredom. Who broke the moment? Nephew, I need you for a matter of some urgency. Your lord father wishes to discuss the tourney accounts, and you know how he despises waiting. It was, transparently, a lie, and Joffrey knew it, and Robb knew it, and none of them said so. Joffrey shot Robb one last look, promising, in its way, more than any words could have, and allowed himself to be led away. Tyrion lingered a moment longer, looking at Robb with something that might have been respect and might have been pity, or perhaps both together. You have your father's spine, he said. In this city, that is either the finest quality a man can possess, or a death sentence written early. Sometimes both. Watch yourself, wolf boy. Joffrey does not forget being made small, and he has never once in his life been taught that there are consequences for the things he wants to do about it. That night, Robb told his father what had happened, not all of it. Not the precise words, but enough. Ned listened in the particular stillness he reserved for matters he was already turning over for danger, and when Robb finished, his father was quiet for a long moment. You did not lie, Ned said finally. You did not back down from a truth spoken plainly. I cannot fault you for that, and I would not have you become the kind of man who bends his knee to cruelty simply because it wears a crown. He paused, and something in his face made Robb feel, for the first time since arriving in King's Landing, genuinely afraid, not for himself, but for what his father was seeing that Robb could not yet see. But you must understand something, and understand it now, not later. Honor in this city is not armor. It does not protect you. It only tells you, afterward, what kind of man you were when the blade fell. Joffrey will be king one day. You have made an enemy of him, and enemies here do not forget, and they do not fight fair. Then what would you have had me do? Robb asked. Bow to him. Let him call me a dog-smelling peasant and smile. No, Ned said, and something like sorrow moved behind his eyes. I would have you understand that there was no choice here that did not cost you something. That is King's Landing's only honest lesson, Robb. Every path costs. The only question is what you're willing to pay, and when the bill comes due. Robb did not sleep well that night. He thought of the North, of Winterfell's silences, of a world where a Stark's word and a Stark's sword meant something clean and simple. He thought, too, of the way Sandor Clegane's dead eyes had watched him without blinking, and the way Joffrey's hand had drifted toward a blade he did not yet know how to use. He did not know it yet, but 400 leagues north, in Winterfell's solar, his mother Catelyn had just received word that her husband and both her eldest son were now further from home and further from safety than she had ever imagined she would allow. The Raven reached Winterfell on a gray morning thick with the promise of early snow, and Maester Luwin carried it to Catelyn Stark in the Godswood, where she had taken to walking more often, since her husband and eldest son had ridden south. She read it twice before she folded it, and Luwin, who had served House Stark long enough to read a woman's face as easily as any scroll, saw something tighten behind her eyes. Lord Stark writes that Robb comports himself well at court, she said, when she trusted her voice, that the king has taken a liking to him, that there is talk already of a possible match with one of the Tyrell daughters, when he is a few years older, to bind the North closer to the reach. She looked up at the ancient weirwood, face carved into the heart tree, its red eyes weeping their eternal sap, and Luwin thought she looked, in that moment, very much like a woman speaking to the tree rather than to him. He does not write that he is safe. He writes that he is useful. I am not certain those are the same thing in that city. My lady, Lord Stark is a careful man. Lord Stark is an honorable man. Maester Luwin, which in King's Landing, I am told are not always the same virtue. Catelyn's hand had gone, without her quite seeming to notice, to the small carved dire wolf Robb had given her before he left, a boy's clumsy whittling, made with more love than skill. My husband has taken both himself and my son's future into a nest of vipers, and left Winterfell to be governed by a 9-year-old boy, a maester, and whatever wisdom I can offer a household that still looks to a Stark man for its final word. It was not, Luwin understood, an accusation. It was worse. It was a fear too large to be spoken plainly, given voice instead in the careful, sideways language of a lady who had been raised never to say aloud the thing she feared most. The problem, though unspoken in Catelyn's letter and unspoken in Ned's careful reassurances from the south, had already begun to take shape among the northern lords, and it moved the way such things always moved in the north, slowly, in whispers over ale and hearthfire, in the long silences of men who did not trust easily and trusted. Southern courts least of all. Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor was the first to say it plainly, at a modest gathering of bannermen. Catelyn convened at Winterfell to discuss the autumn levies, a gathering that had, without anyone quite planning it, become something closer to a council of the North's uncertain heart. Forgive an old man his bluntness, my lady, Manderley said, his great bulk settling into a chair that groaned beneath him. But every soul in this hall knows what I am about to ask, so I will simply ask it. If ill should befall Lord Stark in that viper's nest of a city, and may the old gods forbid it, who then leads the North? The heir is with him. Winterfell holds a boy of 9, a maester, and a lady who, however capable, was not born to this land and cannot sit a northern lord's seat by law or custom. The hall had gone very quiet. Catelyn felt every eye upon her, and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent years learning to read a room of proud men, that this was a wound Manderley had not created but merely named, one that had been growing, unspoken, since the day Ned rode south with both his lords, authority and his heir's future, bundled together and carried 400 leagues from the only ground where either meant anything. Bran is trueborn, and Robb's heir until Robb has sons of his own, she said, careful to keep her voice level. though her heart hammered beneath her composure. The line of succession is not in question. The line of succession is fine parchment law, my lady, and parchment does not hold the north together when wolves come sniffing at a weak door. This from Lord Serwyn, younger and blunter than Manderley, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword he had not needed to draw in a decade. The Boltons have not forgotten old grievances. The mountain clans test their leashes whenever they smell uncertainty in Winterfell. A child cannot ride out and remind them why the North fears the wolf. Forgive me, but a maester and a southern-born lady cannot either. However wise or beloved, it was Roderick Castle, master-at-arms and a man Catelyn trusted as much as any in the North, who finally gave voice to the fear beneath the fear. What Lord Serwyn does not wish to say outright, my lady, is this: if the worst should happen in King's Landing, if Lord Stark falls, and Robb with him, trapped too far south to ride home, the North has no clean answer for what comes next. Bran cannot rule at 9. There would be regents and factions, and every ambitious lord from here to the last river finding reasons to test whether Winterfell's grip has finally loosened after 300 years of Stark rule. He did not finish the thought aloud, but he did not need to. Every man in the hall could finish it for him. And a North divided against itself is a North the Lannisters, or worse, could break entirely. Catelyn sat with that fear for 3 days before she wrote her letter south. Not to Ned, whose judgment she trusted even as she questioned his caution, but to Robb himself, in the private hope that a mother's plainer words might land where a wife's careful diplomacy could not. You are the North's future. Whatever your father believes, you must learn first. She wrote, by candlelight, with Bran's boyish laughter drifting up faintly from the yard below, a sound that felt, in that moment, unbearably fragile. I do not doubt the wisdom in learning the game your father plays, but learn it quickly and learn to survive it. Because there are men here who whisper that Winterfell cannot hold much longer with both its lord and its heir, sitting in a stranger's city, and I do not have the answer that would silence them. Come home when you can, and come home whole. The North needs you more than King's Landing does. Whatever your father believes he is teaching you there. She sealed it with the direwolf sigil and sent it south with her fastest rider, not knowing, could not have known, that by the time it reached King's Landing, the city her son now called a second uneasy home would already be tightening around both Starks like a snare drawn, slow and patient by hands that had been planning far longer than either Ned or Robb yet understood. In Winterfell's Godswood that night, Catelyn knelt before the heart tree, though she had never been a believer in the old gods, and prayed to whatever power might be listening, her husband's gods or her own, that the lesson Ned meant to teach their son would not become the reason the North lost them both. The weirwood's carved face wept its red sap in silence, as it always had, indifferent to the fears of Starks and the ambitions of lesser men alike, keeping whatever secrets 10,000 years of northern winters had taught it to keep. The summons came 7 days after the incident in the training yard, and it arrived in a form calculated, Robb would later realize, to look like nothing at all. A polite invitation from the Crown Prince to join him, and a small party for an afternoon of falconry along the Kingswood's northern edge, the kind of courtesy a future king might extend to smooth over a small unpleasantness with a visiting lord's son. Ned had read the invitation with a frown he did not fully explain, and had told Robb only to be watchful, to speak little, and to remember that courtesy in King's Landing was very often a blade with a velvet grip. Robb understood why the moment he saw who else had been invited. Joffrey held court in the saddle the way he never quite managed, to on solid ground, more at ease, more expansive, flanked by Sandor Clegane and 2 other members of the party Robb did not recognize, minor lordlings of House Lannisters, wider orbit who laughed at Joffrey's jokes with the particular eagerness of men who understood exactly whose favor kept them fed. There was no falconer in sight for the first hour. There was, instead, a slow ride deeper into the Kingswood than Robb had expected, conversation that circled and circled without quite landing anywhere, and a growing, prickling awareness in Robb's chest that he had walked, or rather, ridden, into something his father's warning had not fully prepared him for. Your father tells the king you Northmen respect strength above all else, Joffrey said when they had gone. far enough that the sounds of the city had faded into birdsong and the creak of saddle leather. Is that true, Wolf Boy? That you measure a man only by what he can do, not what he wears? He said it lightly, but Robb heard, underneath, his own words from the training yard being handed back to him like a challenge. It's part of it, Robb said carefully. We measure a man by his word, too, and by how he treats those with less power than himself. How poetic. Joffrey's smile did not reach his eyes. Robb was beginning to understand that very few smiles in King's Landing did. Let's test the first part, then. I hear Northmen are fine archers. Better than Southron lords, your father claims, when he thinks no one is listening to his boasting. This was, Robb suspected even then, an invention. His father did not boast, had never boasted, in Robb's hearing. But he said nothing, only accepted the bow one of the lordlings offered him with a flourish that felt more like a trap being sprung than a genuine invitation to sport. The target, when it was set, a stag skin stretched over a wooden frame, propped against a tree at a modest distance, seemed innocent enough. Robb loosed 3 arrows, and 3 arrows found their mark cleanly. The old muscle memory of Winterfell's yard steadying his hand even here. Even now, with Joffrey's pale eyes fixed on him, with an intensity that had nothing to do with sport. Good, Joffrey said, and something in his voice had gone thin and tight. Very good. Let's raise the stakes, then, shall we? A wager between future lords. He gestured, and one of the lordlings produced, from a saddlebag, a small wicker cage, and inside it, Robb saw with a lurch of understanding, a rabbit, wild-eyed and trembling against the woven walls. A moving target, Joffrey said, is a truer test than a stag skin that doesn't run. Let's see if northern honor extends to killing. Something helpless for sport, Wolf Boy. Or if that's a Southron vice you're too pure for. Robb felt the trap close around him with a clarity that made his stomach turn cold. This was not about archery. This had never been about archery. It was Joffrey, 7 days patient, finding the precise shape of humiliation he wanted to inflict. Not a blade in the dark, not yet, but a public choice designed to cost Robb something no matter which way he turned. Refuse, and he was soft, unmanly, unworthy of the North's reputation for strength. A story Joffrey could carry back to court and tell with relish. Comply, and he became, in front of witnesses, a boy who killed a helpless creature at a cruel prince's whim, the first small brick in a wall of complicity Robb sensed. With a 15-year-old's dawning and unwelcome sophistication, Joffrey intended to keep building. He thought of his father's words. Every path here costs something. The only question is what you're willing to pay. I'll hunt anything that hunts fair, my prince, Robb said finally, keeping his voice level though his pulse hammered in his throat. A caged animal with nowhere to run isn't sport. It's cruelty wearing sports clothes. Where I'm from, we don't confuse the two, and I won't start today to please an audience. The silence that followed had teeth in it. One of the lordlings actually laughed, a short, nervous bark, quickly swallowed, and Sandor Clegane's scarred mouth twitched in what might, on another man's face, have been the ghost of approval. Joffrey's face, by contrast, went through several colors in quick succession, settling finally on a blotchy, furious red that made him look, for a moment, exactly as young and small as he truly was beneath the crown prince trappings. You dare call me cruel, Joffrey said, very quietly, which Robb was already learning was more dangerous than shouting. I called the game cruel, my prince, not you. It was a thin distinction, and both of them knew it. And Robb offered it anyway, because his father's other lesson, do not give a man more reason to hate you than he already has, was fighting a losing battle in his chest against something older and less careful, something that tasted like Winterfell's yard and his own father's voice saying a Stark does not hide from what he believes is right, even when it costs him. Joffrey did not order the rabbit killed that day, not by Robb's hand, at least. He drew his own sword instead, a boy's clumsy, vicious stroke, and ended the creature himself. Badly, in a way, that took 2 strikes instead of 1, and left even his own lordling companions looking faintly ill. He sheathed the blade, breathing hard, and looked at Robb with an expression that had shed all pretense of courtesy. You will regret this, he said. Not today, but you will. They rode back to the Red Keep in near total silence. and Robb spent every mile of it turning the encounter over, searching for where he might have chosen differently, and finding, as his father had warned him he would, no path that would not have cost him something. He had kept his honor. He understood with a cold certainty settling into his bones, made an enemy who would one day hold every lever of power in the Seven Kingdoms, and who did not forget being made to look small in front of witnesses. He told his father everything that evening, all of it this time, and watched Ned's face grow graver with every detail. When Robb finished, Ned was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though it might offer counsel the rest of the room could not. "You did right," he said finally. "I want you to hear that clearly, because what follows will make you doubt it. You did right, and I am proud of the man you're becoming. Even here, even in this city that punishes exactly the kind of courage you showed today." He turned to face Robb fully, and something in his eyes had gone very old, very tired. "But Robb, hear me now, and hear me well. Joffrey will be king. Sooner than any of us would wish, I fear, given how Robert treats his own body. And kings remember every humiliation, real or imagined, visited on them as princes. You have made yourself a mark in that boy's mind, and marks like that do not fade. They wait. Then what would you have me do differently?" Robb asked, and heard, in his own voice, an edge of genuine fear beginning to surface beneath the anger. "Become someone I'm not. Bow to cruelty because the man ordering it might one day hold a crown." "No," Ned said again, as he had said before. And Robb understood that this no, always the same answer given with the same sorrowful conviction was the closest thing to a compass his father possessed. "In this city of shifting ground, I would have you understand what it costs, so that when the bill comes due, you are not surprised to find yourself paying it. That is the only mercy I can offer you here, Robb. Not safety. I cannot promise you safety in this city, not truly, not for either of us. Only the truth of what your honor will cost, so you can choose it with open eyes." Outside, unseen by either of them, a raven was already being prepared in the rookery above the tower of the Hand, not one of Ned's, but one bearing House Lannister's crimson wax, carrying a private account of the day's events to Cersei, who would read it with the particular satisfaction of a woman gathering one more piece for a board she had been quietly arranging for weeks. The North's heir had shown himself, in a single afternoon, to be exactly what she needed him to be: proud, principled, and utterly unable to bend, which made him, in the calculus of King's Landing's oldest game, not an ally to be courted, but a piece to be moved or broken, whichever proved more useful when the moment finally came. The invitation to Peter Baelish's private chambers came a fortnight later, delivered not by page or raven, but by Baelish himself, who found Robb alone in the Red Keep's Godswood, a small, sad thing compared to Winterfell's ancient wood, a single weirwood sapling and a scattering of other trees pressed into a corner of the castle grounds, as though the Seven Kingdoms' oldest gods were an afterthought here, tolerated rather than honored. "You come here often," Baelish observed, settling onto the stone bench beside Robb with the easy familiarity of a man who considered every space in King's Landing his own. "I confess I find it curious. Most northern lords I've known treat the godswood like a chapel. You look, if you'll forgive my saying so, like a man visiting a grave." "It reminds me of home," Robb said, which was true, and which he immediately regretted saying, because Baelish's pale eyes sharpened with interest at the admission, the way a hawk's might sharpen at the flutter of something small and vulnerable in the grass. "Homesickness," Baelish mused. "An honest weakness, and rare enough in this city that I find it almost refreshing. Most men who sit where you're sitting have already learned to pretend they feel nothing at all." He let the silence stretch, comfortable and unhurried, before continuing. "I heard about your afternoon with the Crown Prince. The rabbit. Rather clever, the distinction you drew. Cruelty wearing sports clothes. I don't believe I've heard it put quite that way before. And I've heard a great many men try to wriggle out of Joffrey's little tests. You weren't there. I don't need to be present for a thing to know its shape. Lord Stark. That is rather the entire art of what I do." Baelish smiled, and it was, Robb thought, a genuinely warmer expression than anything he'd yet seen from the man, which made it, somehow, more unsettling rather than less. "You made an enemy of the crown prince to preserve, something your father would call honor. I respect that, genuinely, even if I find the transaction somewhat inefficient. But I wonder if you've considered what happens to inefficient transactions in this city. Once the man who profits from your enemies makes his ledger, Robb felt his spine straighten, some instinct older than his father's. Careful lessons recognizing danger in the pleasant cadence of Baelish's voice. Say what you mean to say, my lord. I've learned enough of this city to know when a man is circling something. Direct. Good. I like directness, it's rarer here than honesty itself. Baelish leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something more private, more confiding. Here is what I mean to say, then. Your father is an honorable man in a city built entirely on the currency of dishonor. He believes his integrity is a shield. It is not. It is a target, painted in the brightest colors this court knows how to aim at. He will not survive this game by playing it honestly. And if he falls, Robb Stark, you fall with him, a hostage in truth, if not in name. For 100 leagues from your own army, your own walls, your own strength. I have watched this exact scenario unfold before. It rarely ends well for the honest man's son. Is this a threat? Gods, no. Baelish looked almost wounded by the suggestion, though Robb was already learning to distrust every expression that crossed the man's face as performance, rather than truth. This is an offer, freely given, from a man who finds himself, against his own better judgment, somewhat fond of you. I have information. I have gold. I have relationships in this city that took me 20 years to build, and that I would be willing, for the right consideration, to extend toward keeping House Stark's heir alive and positioned, whatever storms come. All I would ask in return is a small thing. Trust. The willingness, when the moment comes, to listen to my counsel over your father's. Should the two ever diverge in ways that matter to your survival. There it was, the blade beneath the velvet, laid out plainly, enough that even a 15-year-old, raised on northern directness, could see its shape. Robb sat with it for a long moment and felt, distantly, the echo of every warning his father had given him about this exact kind of conversation, this exact kind of man. My father trusts you well enough to sit beside you on the small council. Robb said carefully. Why would you offer me something you haven't offered him? Because your father would refuse it, Baelish said, without hesitation, and something almost like genuine respect flickered across his face. Eddard Stark believes there is a version of this game that can be won honestly. I find that belief admirable and, I'm afraid, fatal. You, I think, are still deciding what you believe. That makes you interesting to men like me, in ways your father will never be again. And if I refuse as he would, then I will think no less of you for it, and I will still be here. Should circumstances change your calculation. Baelish rose, smoothing his doublet with unhurried care. Chaos is coming to this city, Lord Stark. I feel it the way old men feel rain in their bones. When it arrives, you will find that honor and survival are very rarely the same choice. Whatever your father has taught you to believe, I would simply ask that when that moment comes, you remember this conversation and that the offer, unlike most things in King's Landing, was genuine. He left Robb alone in the small, sad godswood, and Robb sat there a long while afterward, watching the weirwood saplings' few red leaves tremble in a breeze that smelled of nothing familiar, thinking about the precise, patient way Baelish had built his offer, not as a demand, but as a door left deliberately ajar, requiring nothing now, promising everything later. At exactly the moment Robb would be most desperate to walk through it. He did not tell his father about the conversation. This, more than anything else that had happened since arriving in King's Landing, frightened him when he examined it honestly that night. Not what Baelish had said, but his own instinct to keep it private, to weigh it alone, rather than laying it at Ned Stark's feet as he had laid every other trouble since they'd ridden south. Some new, unwelcome part of him had already begun doing the thing his father warned him King's Landing did to every honest man eventually, calculating, weighing, keeping his own counsel in a city that punished those who didn't. He told himself it was simply prudence. He was not yet certain it was a lie. 3 days later, Caitlyn's letter arrived, the one written by candlelight in Winterfell's solar, urging him home, warning him of the North's uncertain heart, while both its lord and its heir sat exposed in a stranger's city. Robb read it twice and felt For the first time since leaving Winterfell, the full weight of what his mother feared laid plain in her careful, worried hand. He thought of Bran, 9 years old and untested, nominally next in line should the worst befall both his father and himself. He thought of Wyman Manderly, and the northern lords his mother had not named, but whose doubts he could feel bleeding through every line she'd written. He showed the letter to his father that evening and watched Ned read it with a stillness that had become, in these past weeks, its own kind of warning sign. "She's not wrong to worry," Ned said finally, folding the letter with care. "I had thought bringing you south. The wiser course, better you learn this game at my side, then face it alone, unprepared, when Winterfell falls to you. I still believe that. But your mother sees a danger. I confess I did not weigh carefully enough before we rode from home." He looked up, and something in his face had shifted, not doubt, exactly, but the first crack in a certainty Robb had never before seen him question. "If matters here grow more dangerous, and I fear they will, faster than either of us would wish, I may need to send you home. Robb, whatever lesson remains unfinished. The North cannot afford to lose both its lord and its heir to a single city's knives. I will not let my caution cost us everything Winterfell has built across 300 years." It was, Robb understood, the closest thing to fear he had ever heard in his father's voice. Neither of them yet knew how little time remained to act on it. King Robert died on a hunt gone wrong, gored by a boar while wine-drunk and reckless, exactly as the years of southern excess had always promised he would, and the city that had felt merely dangerous to Robb in the weeks prior now felt, in the space of a single afternoon, like a trap whose jaws had finally begun to close. He was in the training yard when word reached him, not from his father, but from a breathless page who found him mid-drill and stammered out the news with wide, frightened eyes, as though the mere act of carrying it might make him complicit in whatever came next. Robb dropped his practice sword and ran through corridors that seemed, suddenly, to hold shadows in every alcove, toward the Tower of the Hand and, whatever his father knew that Robb did not yet, he found Ned in his solar, already dressed, already grim, a piece of parchment held in hands that Robb had never once seen shake before and now saw tremble almost imperceptibly. "Robb." His father's voice was tightly controlled, each word placed like a stone being set into a wall that might, at any moment, need to hold back a flood. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to do exactly as I say, without argument. For the first time since we rode from Winterfell. Father, the king is dead. Joffrey will be crowned within the day, perhaps within the hour. I have documents here, proof of Joffrey's true parentage, proof that undoes his claim to the throne entirely, and I mean to use them to see Stannis Baratheon crowned as the law demands. This will not go smoothly. I need you gone from this city before it begins, riding hard for Winterfell, so that whatever befalls me, the North still has its heir safe within its own walls." Ned crossed the room and gripped Robb's shoulders with both hands, and Robb felt, in that grip, the particular desperate strength of a man trying to hold back a tide with his bare hands. "Do you understand me? I need you gone. Tonight. Before the sun rises on whatever this city becomes tomorrow. I won't leave you here alone. You will, because I am telling you to, and because everything I have taught you these past months has been in service of exactly this moment. The moment you must choose the North's survival over your own wants, however much it costs you." Ned's eyes, usually so steady, held something Robb had never seen in them before. Not quite fear, but its close cousin. The desperate calculation of a man who has run out of good options and is choosing, now, among only bad ones. "Your mother was right. To fear what would happen if we were both caught here when the game turned violent. I was wrong not to send you home the moment," she wrote. "I will not compound that error by keeping you here another hour longer than I must." He never got the chance to finish arranging it. The gold cloaks came within the hour, not for Robb, not yet, but for Ned, seized in his own solar on Joffrey's first order as king, dragged from the Tower of the Hand in chains while Robb watched from a servant's stairwell where a terrified household guard had bodily hauled him, whispering, "Hide, my lord, hide. For the love of the Seven, they'll take you too if they see you." He watched his father, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, the most honorable man Robb had ever known, marched through the Red Keep's halls like a common criminal, and felt something in his chest crack open that he suspected, even in that terrible moment, would never fully close again. He did not sleep that night, could not. Hidden in a servant's storeroom that smelled of tallow and old grain while Sir Roderick Castle and 2 guardsmen loyal to House Stark argued in fierce whispers about what could possibly be done. There was no army here. There were no northern bannermen to call, no walls to retreat behind, no gods with 10,000 years deep in Stark blood and Stark memory to offer any protection at all. There was only a 15-year-old boy, 300 leagues from home, whose father sat in a black cell somewhere beneath the very castle. Robb had been taught, months ago, to think of as a place he might one day learn to navigate safely. You are a hostage in truth, if not in name. Baelish's words returned to him in the dark storeroom, and Robb found himself hating the man for having been right, and hating himself more for the small, treacherous part of him that wondered whether that offered door. Chaos is coming. Remember, this conversation might now be the only door left standing. He did not go to Baelish. Not yet. Instead, in the gray hour before dawn, he made a decision that he would spend the rest of his life unable to fully justify by reason alone. He went, disguised in a stable boy's borrowed cloak, arranged through Sir Roderick's desperate contacts among the city's lower orders, not toward escape, but toward the black cells beneath the Red Keep, because some stubborn, unbending northern part of him refused to leave his father to face this alone, whatever the cost of staying. He did not reach the cells. He reached, instead, a narrow servant's passage where Varys found him, seemingly by accident, though Robb had already learned enough of this city to doubt that anything involving the spider was ever truly accidental, and steered him, with soft-spoken urgency, back toward the shadows before a patrol of gold cloaks rounded the corner ahead. You are, at this moment, the single most valuable and most fragile piece left on this board. Lord Stark, Varys murmured, his voice barely more than breath in the dark passage. Your father chose honesty over cunning and now sits in a cell for it. I would not see his son make the same choice tonight. In a corridor where cunning is the only currency that will keep you breathing until morning. Where is my father? Is he alive? For now, Cersei needs him alive, at least until she has secured what she needs from him, a confession, perhaps, or Sansa's continued good behavior as a hostage of her own, or simply the pleasure of holding a proud man's life in her hand a while longer before she decides what to do with it. That may change. It may change quickly, but tonight, the only life you can meaningfully protect is your own, and through it, whatever remains of House Stark once this city has finished with the rest. Why help me at all? Varys's smile, in the near darkness, was unreadable, because a north thrown into chaos by the simultaneous loss of its lord and its heir serves no one's interests but the very worst men in this city. And I find myself, against considerable professional instinct, disinclined to let that happen tonight. Call it realm service, if you like the sound of it. Call it whatever helps you. Trust the hand currently keeping you from a gold cloak's blade. Now come, there is a ship in the bay, and considerably less time than either of us would prefer, before someone realizes the wolf's cub has slipped its cage. Robb went, because there was, in truth, no other choice left that did not end with his own capture and whatever leverage that would hand Cersei over his father entirely, and because some cold, new, calculating part of himself, born in these last desperate hours, understood that a dead or captured heir served the North far worse than a living one who escaped, however much the escaping felt, in that moment, like the deepest betrayal of his life. He did not see his father again before the ship slipped its moorings in the black hour before dawn, carrying him north along a coastline he barely recognized, toward a home that no longer had any certainty of what, or who, he would find waiting when he arrived. Behind him, in a black cell beneath the Red Keep, Eddard Stark would spend the following days believing, hoping that his son had reached open water and safety, the one mercy he could still cling to as Cersei Lannister's plans for him began, slowly and deliberately, to close like a fist. Neither father nor son yet knew that the North itself, in Robb's continued absence and now Ned's confirmed captivity, had already begun to fracture along fault lines. Wyman Manderley and Roderick Castle had warned of weeks before, fault lines that no ship, however fast, could outrun. The North, in the weeks that followed, became a thing without a center, a wheel with no hub, spinning on the memory of Stark authority rather than its living presence. And every lord who had ever quietly resented bending the knee to Winterfell began, in small and large ways, to test how much weight that memory could still bear. Catelyn felt it first in the tone of the letters that arrived at Winterfell. Not defiant, not yet, but subtly less deferential than they had been a season before. The careful courtesies of vassal lords writing to their liege's wife rather than to their liege himself. Lord Manderley's latest missive spoke, with elaborate diplomatic care, of concerning rumors from the south and asked, in language just formal enough to blunt its urgency, whether Winterfell had received any confirmation of Lord Stark's continued good health. Lord Serwyn's letter was blunter still, asking outright when Robb might be expected home, and whether, in his continued absence, the North's bannermen ought to begin preparing for a succession no one wished to name aloud. They smell weakness, Roderick Castle told her grimly, when they convened in the Solar with Maester. Lewin's Raven reports spread across the table like a map of a battle not yet joined but already being positioned for. Not disloyalty, my lady, not yet. But every lord in the North is asking himself the same question. What happens to their oaths if there's no one left to hold them? 300 years of Stark rule, built on the assumption that a Stark always sits Winterfell's seat. We are testing, for the first time in living memory, whether that assumption survives a true crisis. Bran is the heir, should the worst befall Robb as well as his father, Catelyn said. Though even as she spoke the words she heard how thin they sounded against the weight of what the North actually required. Not a name on parchment, not a boy of 9 however brave and clever, but a grown man capable of riding out, of standing before the mountain clans and the Boltons, and every lord with old grievances and new ambitions, and reminding them, with presence rather than paper, why House Stark had ruled this land for 3 centuries. It was into this uncertain space that the first true fracture appeared, not from the Boltons, not yet, whatever old suspicion Roose Bolton's silence carried, but from a quarter Catelyn had not fully anticipated, the mountain clans of the northern hills, the Wools and the Littles and the Norreys, who had never loved Winterfell's rule so much as tolerated it, and who began, in the absence of any Stark strength to remind them otherwise, raiding the lowland holdfasts nearest their territory, with a boldness that had not been seen in a generation. They are testing the wolf's teeth, Roderick said, when word reached Winterfell of a burned granary near the last river and 2 dead crofters, and finding, for the moment, that the wolf has none to show them. He looked at Catelyn with the particular, grim honesty of a man who had served her husband's father before him. My lady, I do not say this to frighten you further, but to be plain where plainness serves us. If this continues unanswered, it will not stop with a granary. Every ambitious man in the North is watching to see whether Winterfell still bites. We need Robb home, or we need someone with a sword, and a Stark name behind it riding out too. Answer this before it spreads. Catelyn made the only choice available to her that would not require waiting on a 15-year-old boy trapped in a hostile city 3 weeks distant. She sent Roderick Castle himself, with what men-at-arms Winterfell could spare, to answer the mountain clan's raids with enough northern steel to remind them that Stark absence was not Stark weakness. It worked, after a fashion. Roderick's small force put down the worst of the raiding within a fortnight, burning no villages in turn but making clear, through disciplined and visible force, that Winterfell's reach still extended into the hills even without a Stark riding at its head. But it was a stopgap, not a solution, and every lord in the North understood the difference. A Castellan's sword, however well wielded, was not a lord's authority. And the deeper question, what happens to the North if both Ned and Robb never return at all, remained unanswered and unanswerable, hanging over Winterfell's halls like a held breath. It was Maester Lewin, 3 weeks after Roderick's return, who brought Catelyn the Raven that changed the shape of the crisis entirely. Not word from King's Landing, but word carried by fishing boat and hurried courier along the White Knife. that a ship bearing House Stark's colors, battered by weather and pursued, by some accounts, for the better part of its journey north, had made port at White Harbor with a single passenger of consequence aboard. Caitlin read the message with hands that shook so badly. Lewin had to steady the parchment for her to finish it. Robb lives. Robb is coming home. She did not yet know, could not know, not from a hurried courier's message, what state her son would arrive in, what he had witnessed, what had been asked of him or taken from him in that city of knives and honeyed words. She knew only that the North's uncertain heart had, in that single message, found something solid to hold to at last. Not a boy of 9 and a legal fiction of succession, but a living heir, blooded by King's Landing's cruelty in ways she could only imagine, riding hard now toward a home that had spent 2 months learning, in his absence, exactly how much it needed him. She rode out 3 days later to meet him on the King's Road rather than wait within Winterfell's walls, unable to bear the distance a moment longer than necessary. And when she finally saw him, thinner than he'd left, harder around the eyes, in a way that no 15-year-old boy should have acquired in a single season, but alive, whole, unmistakably her son, she found herself weeping in a way she had not permitted herself since the day he and Ned first rode south. "Where is your father?" she asked, though some part of her already feared the answer, watching Robb's face for the truth before he spoke it. "A prisoner," Robb said, and his voice had changed too, steadier, colder in places it had never been cold before. The voice of a boy who had watched his father dragged away in chains and spent a fortnight at sea with nothing to do but turn that image over and over, sharpening himself against it. "Cersei holds him. Joffrey sits the throne. I left him there, mother, I left him, because Varys told me a captured heir served no one. And I believed him, and I have hated myself for it every hour since. And I would do it again tomorrow because he made me understand it was the only choice that didn't hand Cersei everything." Caitlin pulled her son into an embrace that he received stiffly at first, and then, after a moment, returned with something like his old self breaking through the new hardness. A 15-year-old boy, however much King's Landing had aged him, still grieving a father he did not know if he would ever see again. "You made the choice your father would have wanted," she told him, though she was not entirely certain it was true, only certain that he needed, desperately, to hear it. "Now come home, and let the North see its heir returned. And let us decide together what we do next, because I promise you, Robb, whatever comes of your father's captivity, the North will not go to whatever men in King's Landing think it will." Behind them, riding at the edges of the returning party, with the wary alertness of men who had spent the crossing watching every shadow for pursuit, Ser Roderick's small honor guard carried something else besides. Robb's exhausted, changed presence, word, gathered from White Harbor's docksides and passed along the ride north, that Joffrey's small council had already begun sending riders of their own, quietly, toward the north, carrying an offer of terms for House Stark's continued submission that no one in Winterfell had yet seen, but that every lord who heard the rumor of its coming understood, instinctively, would demand something neither Caitlin nor her son would find easy to give. The North had its heir home at last. What it did not yet have was any certainty that Robb Stark, 15 years old, freshly hardened by grief and captivity's near miss, carrying inside him both his father's unbending honor and the first cold lessons of a city built to punish. It was prepared for what waited on the other side of Winterfell's gates. The rider from King's Landing arrived at Winterfell 6 days after Robb, under a peace banner and wearing Lannister crimson with the particular smugness of a man who knew he carried leverage no northern lord could easily refuse. He was received in the Great Hall, before the full gathering of northern bannermen Caitlin had summoned the moment word reached her of his approach. Manderley, Serwyn, Glover, the Umbers, even a wary contingent from Roose Bolton's household, all come to witness whatever terms the crown had sent north, because every one of them understood that this moment would decide, in ways a season of uncertain letters could not, whether the North's loyalty to House Stark still meant something binding or had become, in Ned's captivity, a question each lord would now answer for himself. "Lord Stark," the herald began, addressing Robb with a courtesy that felt, to every northern ear in the hall, like mockery dressed in proper form. Her Grace the Queen Regent extends her sympathy for your father's unfortunate circumstances and offers, in her mercy, terms by which House Stark might resolve this matter without further bloodshed. He unrolled a scroll bearing the royal seal and read it aloud, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. Lord Eddard Stark, having conspired against the crown's rightful succession, shall be permitted to take the black and serve out his days at the wall, his crimes forgiven in the king's mercy, provided House Stark, through its heir, formally renounces any claim of grievance against the crown, swears fresh oaths of fealty to King Joffrey, and provides 200 northern spearmen to serve the crown's garrison at King's Landing as a token of good faith, to remain there so long as his grace deems necessary. The silence that followed was not the silence of a hall considering terms. It was the silence of a hall recognizing an insult wrapped in diplomatic language. Hostages. Robb understood immediately. 200 northern men held in King's Landing exactly as his father had been held, exactly as he himself so nearly had been. A permanent leash disguised as a garrison. He felt Manderley's eyes on him, and Serwyn's, and understood that every lord in this hall was watching to see not what the terms said, but what the North's actual heir, tested now, blooded now, no longer the untested boy who'd ridden south 8 months before, would do with them. You ask me to hand over 200 of my father's sworn swords to sit as prisoners in the city that has already tried to make a prisoner of me, Robb said, and heard his own voice come out steadier than he'd expected, carrying clearly to the hall's furthest corners. You ask this in exchange for my father's freedom, which your Queen Regent has not actually offered, only a black cloak and a posting to the wall, which is not freedom, but exile dressed, prettily enough that you hoped a grieving son might not notice the difference. The herald's composure flickered, just slightly. The terms are generous, given the crimes. My father's crime, Robb cut in, and felt something old and stark and unbending rise up in him, tempered now by everything King's Landing had taught him, was refusing to help your Queen Regent hide that her children are not the King's trueborn heirs. That is the truth of it, whatever language your scroll uses to dress it otherwise. Every lord in this hall already knows it. I expect every lord in the 7 kingdoms will know it eventually, whether your queen wishes it or not. It was, Robb understood even as he said it, the single most dangerous sentence he had spoken since setting foot outside Winterfell's walls, an open accusation of treason and incest against the crown, spoken before witnesses, in a hall full of men whose loyalty he could not yet fully guarantee. At a moment when his father's life still hung on Cersei's patience rather than her mercy, he felt Catelyn's sharp intake of breath beside him, saw Manderley's eyes widen fractionally, understood that he had just committed House Stark to a path with no quiet retreat remaining. He did it anyway, because some calculation, cold and clear and entirely his own, had already told him that quiet retreat was no longer available regardless, that Cersei's terms were never truly an offer of peace, only a slower, more humiliating road to the same destination his father's honesty had already put them on, and that a North that watched its heir bend the knee to a lie would be a North that stopped believing in its bones that House Stark's word meant anything at all. The herald left within the hour, white-faced and furious, carrying Robb's refusal south along with a promise, delivered coldly, deliberately, by Robb himself, before the assembled lords, that House Stark would send no hostages, would swear no fresh oaths built on a foundation of lies, and would instead call its banners and march south to demand Lord Eddard Stark's true and unconditional release, by force if the crown's mercy proved as false as its terms suggested. It was, Robb knew even as he said it, a declaration of war in everything but name. That night, in Winterfell's solar, with Catelyn's face still pale from the day's events and Maester Luwin hovering with the particular anxiety of a man who had spent decades counseling caution to men no longer inclined to hear it, Robb sat with the full weight of what he had just set in motion. You could have accepted the terms, Catelyn said, not as accusation, but as a mother, trying to understand. A son who had returned to her, fundamentally changed. Bought time. Your father might still. My father would not have wanted 200. Northern men held hostage to buy him a black cloak he'd, whereas a cage instead of a cell. Robb said, and heard, underneath his own certainty, the small aching fear that he might be wrong, that his father might have chosen differently, more carefully. In ways 8 months in King's Landing had not fully taught his son to weigh. I watch what that city does to honest men who play by its rules hoping for mercy. Mother, I won't gamble the North's strength on the hope that Cersei Lannister has any mercy left to give, when every lesson I learned in that city told me otherwise. Then you understand what comes next, Luwin said quietly. War, Lord Stark. Not a raid answered with steel. Not a border dispute settled with a show of force. War against the crown itself, with your father's life the first and most immediate stake, and the North's strength the only leverage left to save him. Robb thought of Joffrey's pale, furious eyes over a dying rabbit, of Baelish's patient offer in the small, sad godswood. Chaos is coming, remember this conversation. Of Varys, steering him through dark passages with words about hostages and pieces on a board. Of his father, dragged away in chains while Robb watched from a servant's stairwell, helpless in a way he had sworn, in that terrible moment, he would never allow himself to be again. I understand, he said. Send the ravens. Call the banners. If King's Landing wants to test whether the North still has teeth, we'll give them an answer they won't mistake for weakness again. Outside the Solar's window, the first hard frost of the season had settled over Winterfell's godswood, silvering the ancient trees in the pale moonlight, a small, indifferent reminder, had anyone paused to notice it, that whatever war of men was now being called into motion, an older and colder war was already advancing from far beyond the wall, entirely unconcerned with which southern faction held which captive, or which northern lord called which banner. For now, that older war remained a rumor from the Black Brothers, a shadow at the edge of maps no southern lord had ever bothered to study closely. Robb Stark had a nearer war to fight first and a father to save, and 8 months of King's Landing's hardest lessons to carry with him into it. The North's banners answered faster than even Catelyn had dared hope, and within a month Robb stood at the head of a host 18,000 strong gathered in Winterfell's yard, more men than his father had ever commanded. In his own name, more men than Robb, 8 months ago, would have believed himself capable of calling into being. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, riding south at the columns, head with gray wind loping, silent and gray at his horse's side, Robb felt mostly the crushing, unfamiliar weight of 18,000 lives now bent to decisions he had made. Decisions that would be judged not by whether they were honorable, but by whether they kept his father breathing long enough to matter. The war that followed did not unfold the way the songs would later claim. There was no single battle that broke it open. There was, instead, a grinding, uncertain campaign through the riverlands, skirmishes at forts, a costly siege at a Lannister-held keep whose name Robb would remember for the rest of his life because of how many northern dead it cost him, and always, beneath every tactical decision, the same unbearable calculation. Every day the war continued was another day. Cersei Lannister might decide that a living Eddard Stark had become more liability than leverage. It was at the twins, crossing the Trident on Lord Walder Frey's grudging goodwill, that Robb learned the true cost of the choice he'd made in that Kingsroad meeting. 8 months before, the cost that had been waiting for him, patient as Baelish's offer, since the day he'd chosen his father's honor over his own survival in a servant's passage beneath the Red Keep. The Raven found him in his command tent 3 nights after the crossing, its message brief and merciless in the particular way only Varys's careful hand could manage. Lord Stark executed on the Crown's order. 3 days passed before the assembled court at King's Landing, his head displayed upon the city walls. The Queen Regent regrets that patience, in the end, proved a currency she could not afford to extend further. Your refusal of her terms at Winterfell is understood to have hastened this outcome, though I suspect you already knew this would be so. Robb read it once, and then again, and felt something inside him go very still and very cold. Not the hot grief he might have expected, but something quieter and more dangerous. A settling of purpose that frightened him more than tears would have. He thought of the training yard, the rabbit, Baelish's patient offer, the black cell he'd nearly walked into trying to reach his father one last time. He thought, most of all, of his father's voice in a solar lit by firelight. Every path here costs something. The only question is what you're willing to pay. He had paid it now. His father had paid it first, and worse. Gray winds low. Mournful howl rose from outside the tent as though the dire wolf had understood before. Robb had finished reading, and within the hour the entire camp knew. And Robb Stark, 15 years and some months old, 8 months hardened by a city, that had taught him precisely how honor gets you killed, stood before his assembled lords in the flickering torchlight with a choice to make that would define not just this war, but the entire shape of what House Stark would become in its aftermath. The lords wanted him crowned. He heard it building in the murmur that spread through the camp before anyone dared say it to his face. King in the North, a title no Stark had claimed in 300 years, offered now not as ambition but as answer, a way to say to Cersei Lannister and her false king and every lord in the 7 kingdoms that the North would no longer bend its knee to a crown that murdered honest men for refusing to lie. It was Baelish's voice that came to him in the quiet hour before he gave his answer. Not literally. The man was 300 leagues distant. But the memory of that conversation in the small sad godswood. The offer left deliberately ajar. Chaos is coming to this city. When it arrives, you will find that honor and survival are very rarely the same choice. Robb understood now, with a clarity that felt older than his years should have allowed, that Baelish had been right about the shape of what was coming, wrong only about which side of the choice Robb would ultimately stand on when it arrived. He could accept the crown and lead the North as its honorable, grieving king, exactly as his father would have wanted, fighting a righteous war for a righteous cause, and likely, if King's Landing's lessons held true, dying for it eventually the way his father had. Or he could do the thing his father's honor would never have permitted, and his own hard-won education. And that city of knives now whispered was the only path that actually kept the North's remaining strength alive to matter. He sent for Roose Bolton that night, alone, and made an offer that no bard would ever sing of with pride, a private arrangement, cold and calculated in exactly the way his father would have, refused and Baelish would have, applauded, trading future consideration and northern favor for something Robb needed more urgently than honor's clean conscience. Intelligence on Lannister troop, movements that Bolton's quiet correspondence with King's Landing had made possible, purchased with Robb's silent agreement to overlook exactly how Bolton had come to possess it. It won him the battle that followed, a rout of a Lannister force that should have taken him weeks to locate, and cost him a third of his remaining strength to defeat honestly. It also meant that Robb Stark, not yet 16, standing over a battlefield thick with dead men in Lannister crimson, had just done the thing his father never would have countenanced, made common cause, however briefly and privately, with a man whose loyalty was a rumor at best. In exchange for a victory his honor alone could not have purchased, he told no one but Grey Wind the full truth of how the intelligence had come to him. He told himself, standing in the wreckage of a battle won at a cost he would carry silently for the rest of his life, that his father had taught him this lesson without meaning. 2. That every path in this war, as in that city, cost something, and that the only mercy left to him now was choosing, with open eyes, precisely what he was willing to pay. When his lords came to him 3 days later, kneeling in the mud of a battlefield still smoking with the war's latest cost, and named him king in the North, Robb Stark accepted the crown not as the untested boy who had ridden south 8 months before, believing honor and survival might yet prove the same road. He accepted it as something his father had never quite managed to become in that city of knives, and had died, in the end, for failing to become in time, a man who understood, with cold and total clarity, that the North's survival might require choices Eddard Stark's honor never could have made, and who had already, in the quiet hours after a raven's cruel message, decided he would make them anyway, whatever they cost his own soul in the paying. Gray winds howl rose again over the battlefield as the lords' voices took up the chant, the king in the North. And somewhere far to the south, in a city, Robb Stark now understood better than any northern boy ever should have needed to. Cersei Lannister received word of the coronation with the particular, unpleasant realization that the honorable man's son she had ordered executed to send a message had not, in fact, learned the lesson she'd intended. He had learned an entirely different one instead, and the war that followed would prove considerably harder to win than her small council had ever anticipated. The war ground on through another year, and Robb Stark, king in the north now, though he wore the title with none of the swagger such words might have inspired in a lesser man, fought it with a blend of his father's tactical brilliance and something harder, colder, more calculating that Winterfell's yard alone could never have taught him. He won battles that should have been losses. He read Lannister movements with an unsettling precision that Tywin Lannister himself, receiving reports of yet another ambush sprung with impossible foreknowledge, began to suspect meant a source closer to his own counsels than he wished to imagine. It was the marriage that nearly undid him, not broken from love, as another life's telling of this war might have gone, but avoided entirely because 8 months in King's Landing had taught Robb Stark exactly what oath-breaking cost a man in this world of ice and fire, and he had buried his father for less. He married Lord Frey's daughter as promised, dull-eyed and dutiful in a way. That cost him something private and unspoken. Every night, he lay beside a wife he had not chosen for love, and in exchange, the twins remained open to him, and the wedding that history might otherwise have called red never came to pass at all. The war ended not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Both sides bled white by 2 years of grinding conflict, brought to parley not by decisive victory, but by the mutual, unspoken understanding that continuing to fight served no one but the crows feeding on the Riverlands dead. Tywin Lannister, ever the pragmatist, offered terms that acknowledged what neither house could any longer deny. The North, under Robb Stark's cold new competence, would not be conquered by force, whatever Cersei's fury demanded. Robb, for his part, understood, as his father never fully had, that total victory was a fantasy the war's exhaustion could no longer afford, and that a North independent in all but name, its king's title quietly unrecognized by the Iron Throne but its borders unassailed, was a victory his father's ghost would have to accept. However imperfectly, it honored the honesty Ned Stark had died defending. He stood in Winterfell's Godswood on the night the terms were finally signed, before the ancient weirwood that had watched 300 years of Stark lords come and go, and found himself speaking aloud to a father who could no longer hear him. "I did not do it your way," he said, into the cold silver silence. "I lied. I bargained with Bolton's stolen intelligence. I married a woman I do not love to keep an oath I could not afford to break. I am not certain, some days, whether the man standing here is still your son, or something King's Landing made instead and simply left wearing his face." The weirwood's carved eyes wept, their eternal red sap, offering no answer, no absolution, only the same patient indifference it had offered every grieving Stark before him. "But the North stands. That is what you sent me south to learn, in the end, though neither of us understood it at the time, not how to win with honor and tact, but what a man must be willing to become, so that the people who depend on him do not have to pay for his conscience's comfort." The North remained free, unconquered, its king uncrowned by any southern authority, but unbroken in the field, a settlement that satisfied no one entirely and therefore, in the peculiar calculus of Westerosi politics, endured longer than any decisive victory might have. Sansa remained in King's Landing, a hostage still, her freedom the one term Cersei refused entirely to negotiate. A wound Robb carried, alongside his father's death as unfinished business. The peace had not resolved. Arya's whereabouts remained unknown, a small persistent grief threading through every letter Catelyn wrote north from Winterfell, and beyond the wall, unseen by Lannister gold or Northern steel alike. The true war continued its patient advance, a scattering of nights. Watch reports, growing steadily more urgent, more desperate, reaching a king in the north now hardened enough by southern politics to recognize, when the Ravens finally arrived in numbers too large to dismiss, that the game he had spent 2 years mastering was never the war that mattered most. Robb Stark had survived King's Landing's lesson and paid its full price in the paying, whether the harder, colder king it had made of him would prove strong enough for the darkness still gathering north of his own wall remained. A story Westeros had not yet finished writing.